To the parallel session. In this session, we're very delighted to have Chris Hancon with us, being your presenter. Let me first introduce Chris. Chris is a partner who leads the Hong Kong team of PwC's Asia Actuarial Services practice. He has over 20 years of experience in various areas, including risk management, capital management, market reporting, product design, pricing and distribution, and actuarial valuation for long-term insurers. Chris is an expert in risk and capital management for long-term insurers, and he has led a number of major projects for large insurers of the industry. Chris is also an active member of the actuarial profession. He served on the Council of the Faculty of Actuaries from 2008 to 2010, and a number of working parties as well. He's also a fellow member of the Actuarial Society of Hong Kong. He has a first-class honors degree in mathematics and statistics from the University of Edinburgh. Please give a warm welcome to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Orcus, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be here at the Kerry Hotel. My first time here. I've heard it's the largest ballroom in Hong Kong. You probably already heard that, though. Well, welcome to Hong Kong. Those of you who've traveled here, I hope you're having a good conference. So I lead the Hong Kong team of the Actuarial Services practice of PwC here in Hong Kong. And as Orcus says, I've worked on many projects to do with risk management. And what I thought this afternoon it might be good to do is to spend time looking at this topic of risk appetite, which I think goes right to the heart of what we do as actuaries in our businesses. And it's an area in which actuaries, I think, can and should play a leading role, whether it be in the first line of defense, in writing business, developing products, pricing business, or in the second line of defense, or indeed reporting on business, or in the second line of defense in the risk function. Now, it's not a new topic, but I think it's a topic that everyone in the financial services industry, and actually in broader industry, struggles with. And why is that? Well, because defining risk appetite is not really the challenge. I mean, I'm pretty sure if I asked all of you, do your organizations have a risk appetite statement? You tell me yes, and you may even be able to quote elements of the risk appetite statement. And our PwC, we had a regular survey of corporate governance and interview many board members, and I think in the latest of our surveys, we found 95% of board members, this is across all industries, you know, not just financial services, about 95% said, yes, we've got a risk appetite statement and we know and we understand a bit about that. But that's not the biggest challenge. Making it work for the business is much harder. And making it work harder for the business is even harder again. And so that's at the heart of what we want to do today. We want to look at how to make the risk appetite statement work. And the key to that is to see it as a framework. It's not just about a statement, it's about a process, it's about how to turn that statement into actions that can be taken by the front line, by the business. And to make that happen, the oil in the engine, if you like, and what will really make the wheels go fast in making risk appetite work for the business is high quality and timely management information. So if you start at the top there and think, well, do we have a risk appetite statement? I'm pretty sure all of you do have that. Are we making it work hard for our business? Well, in Asia, my experience in Asia is there's some way to go on that. We all recognize the importance of risk appetite and regulations and emerging regulations, including the new ERM guidelines that have been out for consultation by the insurance authority here, recognize the importance of risk appetite. Are we making it work hard for the business? And are we setting it up as a framework? So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time just reflecting on what we mean by a framework. And there's some very helpful guidance on that from the Financial Stability Board that really emerged from the financial crisis. And then it's how are we doing? And PwC ran a survey on this a few years ago, and some of the results from that survey I'm going to share with you this afternoon are really very relevant, not just from insurance companies, but from banks, and particularly global systemically important banks. And then we'll look at how we put it into practice. So both from a allocation point of view, so I think all of you will recognize the challenge of creating a risk appetite statement at the top of the company, but but the next challenge is then how do you allocate risk appetite down to the business units, down to the product level, down to risk categories ultimately, and then into management actions. Of course, as actuaries, we are very focused on how we not just monitor risk, but how we measure risk. And so measurement of risk is absolutely key to monitoring, to developing a risk appetite statement and to monitoring its progress. So we're going to talk quite a bit about the modeling techniques, and in particular the forward-looking modeling techniques, including stress and scenario testing and projection of capital requirements that are so important here to make risk appetite work harder for the business. And that leads us finally to getting the message out. And this is, again, I think where many of us in the audience would recognize we perhaps struggle, and we'll explain why that is, and perhaps give some ideas as to how to improve the quality of information that we're getting out there. Every presentation I do on risk management, I start with this framework, and it's not unique by any means, but it is a helpful way, I think, of explaining what is enterprise risk management, from strategy at the very top through to all of the enablers at the bottom of the pyramid: people and change and reward, management information, as I said, the lifeblood flowing through the organization, and the technology and infrastructure, which of course is being invested in so much to support these frameworks today. And right at the heart of that, where many of us play the biggest role in risk and capital assessment using models. So if you look where risk appetite is on that, it's very near the top, because it is articulated directly from business strategy. It is what turns business strategy into risk profile, the risk profile that we are experiencing in our business and that we expect to experience in the future. Indeed, it drives risk profile, because to the extent risk appetite expresses our willingness and our appetite to take on risk, and then drives a plan for risk, and ultimately drives management actions, that is going to change our risk profile over time. And so that is how important this is. Recognized as being right at the heart of the board's responsibilities. This was the COSO, who you'll know are very famous for enterprise risk management framework, and they've just refreshed that in the past year, and worth a look at that, and I've got some links to that later. They said just straight after the financial crisis, unless the board fully understands the level of risk that management's willing and able to take, it'll be difficult for the board to effectively fulfill its oversight responsibilities. So risk appetite is, and the board's understanding of risk appetite, absolutely clear. Now, of course, there was a failure of governance 10 years ago, and it's been very interesting to read all of the reflections after 10 years on the financial crisis, but there was clearly a failure of governance 10 years ago. And many reviews, but the one I very often quote is the Walker Review, carried out on behalf of HM Treasury, a review of corporate governance in UK banks and other financial industry entities. And that very much highlighted that risk appetite and tolerance was needed, and enhanced effectiveness of governance really required a renewed focus and a review of risk appetite and tolerance, a recognition that simply hadn't been working in governance. So again, risk appetite had been defined, but very clear that it was not actually being followed through. It was defined at the top level, perhaps in an overarching statement, but not being followed through in the organization, and not being used to drive the right types of decisions and behaviors. And then the Financial Stability Board, and not much had changed. They recognized actually that there was a risk appetite statement, but that risk appetite statement was not being used to drive changes in culture. And a recommendation then for supervisors to articulate and define expectations of what a good risk appetite framework entails, and how to supervise against these expectations. And so following that recommendation, the Financial Stability Board in 2013 published principles for an effective risk appetite framework. And this drives, I think, much of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, because I think it's got some really very helpful definitions and recommendations for how to define a risk appetite framework and how to make it work for the business. And it defined it in, I won't try to read all of that out, but I think the point is that it's a comprehensive way of defining not just the statement itself, but the processes, the controls, and the systems that then enable the risk appetite statement to be communicated, monitored, and driven into action. Should consider the material risks of the firm, as well as the firm's reputation with policyholders, depositors, investors, and customers. And that plays to quantitative risks, but also behavioral risks and some hard to quantify risks like reputational risk. Now, I said that risk appetite is easy to define, but one of the issues with risk appetite, as in so many areas of risk, is language. And having very clear and consistent definitions, and this is vital. And I think these definitions that are in the financial firm is willing to accept in order to achieve its business objectives, but then does that against some important parameters. So risk capacity, the maximum level of risk the institution can assume, given its current level of resources before breaching constraints. And those could be regulatory constraints, could be liquidity, operational environment. So operational environment being, for example, do we have the systems and processes to take on the type of business that we're looking to take on? And what are our obligations to customers? What are the promises that we're making to customers? And what promises have we made to shareholders and other providers of capital? So that's risk capacity. So then we can define risk appetite as the aggregate level and type of risk that we're willing to assume within our risk capacity to achieve our strategic objectives and business plans. So having defined our capacity for risk, appetite is then about our willingness to take on risk within that capacity. And then risk limits take it down to the level of quantitative measures that can actually be used at the business line level or the functional level to pursue business, take on business, underwrite risk. And then, of course, we need a risk profile. So risk profile is, having done all of that, how much risk have we taken on, and what are our gross and net exposures? So net being net of perhaps management actions or controls that we have to control risk. Okay? So some helpful definitions there, and I think if we stick with those definitions, then we can use them. And just to reiterate, when we talk about risk appetite, we're talking about the willingness within risk capacity to take on risk. Now then we might have a target risk profile that we're aiming to achieve. So having set that risk appetite, so we'll have an idea of where we want to get to in the next year or in the business planning horizon. We've got to compare that to where we actually are today against the risks that we are actually running. And that's the actual risk profile. So a risk appetite framework articulates all of that at a point in time, but does so over a business planning horizon as well. So it has to be forward-looking. So this is not just the short-term objectives, it's not just what we're doing next year, but it's also long-term strategic objectives that impact capital requirements and impact our financial outturn. Of course, that could influence compensation plans as well. The framework should ensure that the strategy and risk limits align with the firm-wide risk appetite statement and articulated through roles and responsibilities. So really ensuring that we've got alignment between what we're trying to achieve and what the risk appetite statement says. Should have quantitative measures, but should also have qualitative statements as well within it. So those of you who have articulated risk appetite statements, put them together or reviewed them, will certainly see those quantitative limits as well as qualitative things like, for example, we have no appetite for taking on taking risk that would lead to us doing something illegal or failing to meet the expectations of good conduct. Should be forward-looking and subject to stress and scenario testing. So this is not something that we set and then just live with. It's something that we continuously revise through stress and scenario testing and through feedback from the business. And we'll show how that works from the perspective of looking at it from a top-down perspective, so defining the risk appetite at the top level and then filtering that down to the business unit and product level, but also through bottom-up. So we're getting feedback from the business units, getting feedback from those at the front line in terms of the risks that are actually being run and how much capacity we then actually have to take on risk. And of course, must be tailored to every institution. So this is our risk appetite statement. This is not something you just get, off the internet or a consultant. This is something that you have to spend time with the senior management team and with the board developing, and it's going to be iterative developing this. Anyone who's been through this will know that it takes many, many rounds of trial and error to get this right. So that, I guess, sets the scene. We've defined what we mean by risk appetite framework. We've defined what we mean by risk appetite statement, and our willingness to take on risk within our capacity. Just to illustrate some of the quantitative and qualitative dimensions that this would typically over. Capital. So available capital supports our ability to take on new risks that consume capital, and so risk appetite needs to define how much capital are we prepared to use up in taking on risk. We need to strike a balance there between holding too much capital or not enough capital, of course, and so we'll have some tension between different metrics as we define the capital requirements. Clearly, we'll want to have some view of earnings. What do we want to try and achieve? We'll have some view on that through different lenses, perhaps economic value added, return on risk-adjusted capital type metrics, IFRS, and perhaps IFRS 17 might even give us some insights on that in the future. We might have some liquidity dimension to our risk appetite statement as well. We clearly want to be able to withstand very significant stresses in terms of mass lapse scenarios, or in the case of a bank, a run on the bank. And then the non-quantitative or qualitative types of dimension, such as reputational risk. So identify risks that could impact our brand or our reputation in the market. Okay, so that, I guess, gives us a feel for what a risk appetite statement might look like from the perspective of a statement. So how are we doing, or how is the financial services industry doing against the objectives that are set out in risk appetite statements and the recognition that we need to have a framework? Well, the survey that we did with the International Association of Credit Portfolio Managers, we interviewed a wide range of participants in many jurisdictions around the world, 23 global systemically important banks, 4 global systemically important insurers, and many other banks, insurers, and asset managers. Survey done through questions and an in-depth interview exploring some of the lessons learned, some of the biggest challenges, and planned enhancements to risk appetite frameworks. And what did that find? At the top level, I guess not surprising. The message is that at the top level, at the enterprise level, risk appetite frameworks are reasonably considered by those participants to be reasonably well developed. So they considered themselves to have at least adequate, more than 75% considered themselves to have at least adequate or highly developed or even leading risk appetite frameworks. But then when we go down to the business line and legal entity, feeling that there's more to do. So the state of development of risk appetite as a framework that works for the business at that level, really needing some development. But definitely an appetite to invest more in this, and I guess a recognition that investing in a risk appetite framework is something that could, by some participants they were saying this is something that could lead to competitive advantage. We actually really want to invest in this to be ahead of our peers. And why? Because, again, go back to that pyramid about how we run the business in an enterprise risk management framework. Risk appetite is very much at the top of that pyramid and is the tool through which we can influence the strategy of the business, plan the business. It's this tool through which we can strengthen risk governance to avoid future crises. Of course, satisfy regulatory requirements to the extent that regulatory requirements require us to have risk appetite statement. Of course, we're going to do that. But there's an aspiration to higher value here. There's an aspiration to influencing strategy. And yet some key questions. I think people asking, can we identify a golden thread through strategy and our financial goals and risk appetite and what were the businesses trying to do? Can we find some kind of unifying thread that joins all of that together? That's hard to do in practice. We're going to try and look at some of the techniques in the next few sections. Questions about does our control environment really align to the risk appetite framework? And what does staff on the ground actually say about the risk appetite framework? Because if they don't understand what risk appetite is and can't recognize the framework, can't recognize elements of the framework, then frankly this is pointless, because they're the ones taking risk. They're the ones that are exposing the business to risk. And these higher aspirations of, can I identify competitive value or competitive advantage? Can I use the risk appetite framework in setting strategy and business plans? I would say absolutely yes. But then coming back to, do I get timely and high quality enough management information to enable me to understand how our risk profile is changing and will change in the future against the risk appetite? And so the key challenges, the most frequently cited challenges, as I've alluded to already, were mechanism to allocate risk appetite down to business unit and functional and product level. The integration of risk appetite into the decision-making process, so to the extent we're making big decisions or developing a business plan, how to actually integrate this wonderful statement and set of framework that we put together into our decision-making process. Some concern about how to express and how to define risk appetite, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that this afternoon. I'm going to focus on the first two, really. The mechanism to allocate risk appetite down to the business unit level, and how to integrate it into the decision-making process through measurement. Because I think these are the areas that we as actuaries can play a leading role. So first of all, in terms of allocation, clearly risk appetite, as we all recognize, is something that needs to be set at the very top level in the organization. This is something that needs to be defined by the board and the executive leadership team. And so we can always look at risk appetite from a top-down perspective. The board sets risk appetite, flows it down to the business through the decision-making elements of the business planning, strategic planning, capital planning, liquidity planning, and so on, how we develop products, how we get customers on board, and then flow that into the business lines or business units, and then into lower-level business lines through management information that reports on breaches or near breaches and enables management actions against that. And the limit frameworks that we put in place are a translation of that risk appetite in terms of a budget for risk, if you like, into detailed quantitative limits that the business is operating to. Okay, so conceptually that makes sense. But I also mentioned that there's a bottom-up feedback loop, so it's very, very important that the management information that's being produced at the lower level business units against the limit framework is being fed back up through the business line management, up through the enterprise level stakeholders and senior management, through to those who are taking decision at the top level in the organization, and back up to formulate strategy and targets. And I think if you look at that and think, well, what's happening in my organization? Yeah, certainly we have a strategy, and we see risk appetite and a plan flowing down through the business. I question how well does the bottom-up part work? I mean, you may have this feedback mechanism, but how well does it really work? How much time is senior management actually spending listening to the very detailed messages that are coming back up from management information against the limit framework? And just to illustrate that the top-down bit of it there, the way we described it there was define the risk appetite statement, turn that into some objectives at the business line level, and then turn that, the top level business line level, and then turn that into lower level business line objectives, might be at the product level. And that's what you might call a primary sequencing. So from the enterprise level, we've got top level business line, then we turn that into lower level business line objectives, and then down to perhaps product level. And what we found in the survey was actually the majority of respondents don't just look at it that way. They're also looking at secondary or even supplementary or even further ways of sequencing the allocation of the risk appetite statement down to the lower level. So looking at risk types first, for example, at the top level, and then breaking the risk types down, and then looking at where do we take those risks within our organization, and then really analyze how we take market risk, how we take credit risk, right down at the product level. And that going really quite low. I mean, in many cases, going well beyond 2 or 3 levels, going right down to quite a granular level. And a huge diversity. I mean, this is just the global systemically important banks. A huge diversity in the sequencing of the allocation of risk. And there's no right answer here. I think the point is that many banks and insurers now are looking at the sequencing of the risk appetite statement from the enterprise level down to the business level in many different ways, and getting more and more insight from doing that. Now, in practice, I guess as actuaries, what many of us are very focused on, and what regulations here in Asia and in other parts of the world force us to look at and develop further, is how we use risk appetite to drive capital allocation. So, very simply, we've got a risk appetite statement, we've got some kind of strategy around risk, and we make an assessment of risk based on that top-down and bottom-up view, as we described before. We put a plan and a budget in place against that. So we have a business plan that maybe takes us over a 3 to 5 year horizon that says, well, how much business are we planning to write? What types of business are we planning to write? And then the area that we're most closely involved in as actuaries very often is what are the capital requirements associated with that business plan? And then, given our capacity and given our willingness to take on risk, how do we then allocate capital down to the different objectives of capital, of managing capital, performance reporting, products and pricing, making transfer of risk, and communicating to stakeholders. So once we've allocated capital, making these things work in terms of management information. And if you look at this in a more practical way, you've got the top level view, and I work left side down and then up the right hand side here. You've got the top level view of what risk appetite is. Then we go to the business level and we define tolerances or limits against that risk appetite statement. So how much risk are we willing to take within our capacity? And then break that down into different objectives within each business, and in turn break those objectives down into risk categories. And once we've done that, we've identified our risks at the business level. We've perhaps identified mitigating controls for those risks. So if we've got too much market risk, what are we going to do about it in business B and not objective 1? How are we going to deal with that? What's our action plan to deal with that? And then recognize that we have to then feed that back up to the business unit level in terms of how are those actions actually turning out against our plan. But ultimately, at the top level, we're going to be looking at continuously monitoring that some of the impact of our risks is less than risk appetite, both today and in the future. So turning that into metrics, we'll be looking at exposures, we'll be identifying, I guess, the heat map of exposures at the business unit and at the product level that give us cause for concern or enable us to pursue our strategy. So if we're in the red area, then we know we breached risk appetite. We may have done that in one or two areas, or one or two actions may have breached risk appetite. In the amber area, they may be close to breaching risk appetite, and so we're looking at controls to move them back within risk appetite. But at all times, we're going to be aggregating this together and looking to see that we do not breach risk appetite overall. So this takes us into business planning, it takes us into target and limit setting, it takes us into monitoring. And I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this little example, but this really is just illustrating how you would actually operationalize this in practice. If you were writing some life protection business and you had a plan to write that, you know that you're going to be exposed to some mortality risk, and you know you're going to be exposed to some credit risk, and you have a plan for that, that's your risk appetite, and then how do you monitor that and ensure that you continue to be within tolerance. And if not, then you take management action to rebalance the situation. Now, all of this requires techniques around modelling. It requires us to be able to reflect the risk profile of our business in the capital assessment of our business. It requires us to be able to monitor the capital position and monitor, of course, solvency against regulatory requirements, but also against our risk appetite exposure. And we need to be able to do that on a continuous basis, and we need to be able to do that in a forward-looking way. So if we just think what that means, using models to reflect the risk profile, those of us who've been involved in developing internal models and perhaps even seeking approval from a regulator to use internal models for capital requirements will be well used to this process. This is not about just reading the standard formula and applying that. It's about really understanding the risks that we're exposed to, so doing an assessment of risk and calibrating our model to the risk profile that we have in our business, and then validating the model, running the business, and taking on risk and measuring the capital requirements of our business against the risk profile, and explaining the results, and continuing to go back around that loop. So it's a classic control cycle. And that's about reflecting the risk profile in the capital assessment. But to set the risk appetite statement, we need to have a view not just of our capital requirements today under normal conditions, but also under stress conditions. And so we have to subject the business to stress testing to get a better sense of the dynamics of the balance sheet and how the dynamics of the balance sheet then should influence our risk appetite statement. And in our survey, the use of stress testing, well, actually, surprisingly, there were quite a few people who said that they didn't use stress testing in defining risk appetite. Or at least considered it, but didn't consider it as a critical metric. But the majority, reassuringly, do consider stress testing as a critical metric in defining risk appetite. And a sort of compliance view from some there, so to apply the scenarios or the stresses that are required by the regulators. Perhaps consider a few historical stresses that are beyond those required by the regulators, but most actually really doing some thinking about hypothetical scenarios that, and other scenarios well beyond those required by the regulators that could hit the business, and including, of course, reverse stress testing there as well. So where does this fit in when we talk about risk appetite? We've been talking about how to monitor our exposures against risk appetite at the top level and at the business unit level. Essentially, that is about continuously measuring our risk profile, measuring our risk exposures. And having done that, as I say, it's not just a static assessment, it's how will our risk profile change in different stress conditions and in different scenarios. And that's the way that we can then say, well, given that, have we got the right level of risk in our risk appetite statement? That's a form of validation. Are we measuring the right things in our risk appetite statement? Are there other dimensions that we should be looking at? And thirdly, are we measuring capital in the appropriate way? So does our model reflect our risk profile appropriately? The stress testing leads to all of that and enables us to improve the way that we set the risk appetite statement over time. I said right at the beginning that risk appetite needs to be not just a point-in-time assessment, it needs to be forward-looking as well. And so we should be using the risk appetite statement to demonstrate sustainability of the business plan. So risk appetite informs the risk profile, but in turn, we then need to be able to assess, well, to what extent is the risk profile going to change over our business planning horizon, given the risks that we're planning to take on, given the plans that management have. So today's position is fine, but we need to be able to subject today's position to those stresses on a forward-looking basis. Of course, that requires measurement techniques, curve fitting, and other techniques that you might use, including replicating portfolios and so on, to assess the capital position in a range of different scenarios in a timely way. So rerunning the model every time you want to do this kind of assessment in a large organization is just not feasible. So when we talk about this, we're really talking about how we generate capital, and then how we use capital in the business, and how then we return capital to shareholders. over the business planning horizon. So we're looking at capital over that business planning horizon and how we consume that capital and how that changes in different conditions. And this is a key use of the model. This is a very, very important use of the model. So when we're performing a business planning projection, we will look at the capital consumed by our business plan over maybe 3 to 5 years. So we'll look at the availability of funds, and we'll look at the consumption of funds according to that business plan. Of course, within our business plan, we might have some plans around capital raising, around hedging, around reinsurance. We may have some management actions that we would take in different scenarios. And the internal model that we use to inform this business plan and inform the capital position in the business plan should then reflect different scenarios and reflect management actions in those different scenarios. But that is a business plan with a capital projection like this is the key way that we can then assess, well, the risk appetite, does it make sense over our business planning horizon? And importantly here, the stresses that we're applying here, so the scenario that we show there, maybe some kind of recession in 2021, we should be informing that scenario from the same type of view of stresses and same type of view of risk that we've built into our capital model, all reflecting a view of risk from a quantitative perspective. So that's all about looking at risk profile, continuously assessing risk profile at the top level of the organization and at the business unit level against risk appetite, doing that using stress and scenario testing and doing that in a forward-looking way. All of that's pointless unless you can get the message out, and you want to get the message out to management, and you want to be able to feed that message back to top-level management using the bottom-up process that we described earlier. But anyone who's looked at this will, in their organization, I'm sure, will have complaints about the management information they see. What sort of complaints do we see? Well, we see very often when we're talking about capital and the ability to compute capital requirements, complaints that the process is too slow. We're getting the results of our capital assessment a month or two after the valuation date. Well, by then we're already into the next planning cycle, and the risk events that we were worried about might already have happened. Not insightful, so perhaps not actually covering the right types of risks. Too many versions, very often, of management information packs. No consistency between them. Management information packs that are not aligned to strategy or evolving and growing. How many of you have seen management information packs that started out at 20 pages and then end up being 100 pages after a year or two? Sporadic, infrequent, or just evolved and actually not discussed and not challenged. So what does good look like? I won't go through the list line by line, but I think what we need is a set of well-defined principles for management information. So it needs to be strategic, it needs to be informing, needs to enable decisions, needs to be clear, needs to be graphical, needs to be predictive. These types of principles are what we should really be aiming for. And this requires real planning, and it requires iteration with management to make it work. You think about risk appetite and stress and scenario testing that we were talking about. We're looking at different management information that talks about impacts of different stresses. We're looking at the capital impact of our decisions against risk appetite. We're looking at the KPIs that we're measuring on an earnings and capital basis against risk profile. We're looking at forecasts. Who should see what? Well, top-level management and the board need to see executive summaries, of course, and of course down at the business unit level and the operational level. Then, of course, we'll be seeing much more detailed information. But all of this needs to be connected. It needs to flow both top to bottom and bottom to top. And the type of dashboard that we're talking about to show breaches or near breaches against risk appetite, these can be really quite simple, quite straightforward, with traffic lights, and this type of graphical illustration of risk profile against risk appetite, and forecasts of capital requirements and capital consumption under different scenarios, best estimate and stress scenarios. So it felt really quite rushed because I probably had far too much material. But what I was trying to do was illustrate some of the techniques that, as leaders in our businesses, as actuaries, we can use to help risk appetite work for the business. Not just to define risk appetite, but to make it work for the business, to turn that into something that turns into a plan that can then be measured against under normal scenarios, under stress scenarios, in a forward-looking way. That requires real investment, of course, real investment in modeling, requires real investment in technology, but also requires real investment in behavior, and the types of management information that we're illustrating there is about behavior. It's about how we enable management to take the right decisions through the right lenses. That requires a lot of work of sitting down in workshops with senior management, with the board, and trying this management information out with them and really getting them to engage in it and understand what it means, and importantly then what it means for the definition of risk appetite that they perhaps approved a few years ago and how that might need to change. So high quality and timely management information really is the lifeblood to making this work. Now, all of this is very relevant here in Asia. It's all very relevant here in Hong Kong right now, because if you ask any insurance company what are you focused on right now, one topic will be IFRS 17, I'm sure, but the other topic will be looking very carefully at the risk-based capital requirements that are being developed here in Hong Kong, not just from a quantitative perspective, but also from the perspective of how the capital requirements link to the risk profile of the business and how in turn that compares with the risk appetite that management has set. That takes us into pillar 2. It takes us into the techniques around the ORSA process, and these are the techniques that I think underpin much of this that I expect to see many companies investing in over the years ahead here in Hong Kong. Final word, we did a survey earlier this year, published a survey in May called Risk in Review, a global survey where over 1,200 CROs from all walks of business were interviewed, and you can get that on the website. I've put a link to it on the slides, and it's actually quite an interesting report. It talks about how technology is being used to enable better risk management, and in particular how those who adapt to technology and adapt to change are recognized as being, on average, better at risk management. But those 1,200 respondents were asked how to describe the future of risk management in one word. Would have been nice to have done that today if we had time to click with our phones, but I did think about it, but just thought we won't have time. I wonder how many of you would have used that word, challenging, though. I mean, clearly this is a challenging area, but it's an area in which I think we as actuaries, as I say, can play a major and leading role. So thanks very much. I won't hold you back any longer because I know you've got to get to the plenary session.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone. In view of time, we'll not have a Q&A session, but I'm sure Chris is happy to answer your questions at any breakout times. And on behalf of Actuarial Society of Hong Kong, we have a little souvenir to present to Chris. Thank you.